working on the Riley again. I can't remember where I got to last time, but I have finished all the linkages and things. I ended up buying some 3/16 brass rod to make the linkages. It just seemed to work a lot better than the stainless steel that I had, which I couldn't really get that to take a thread very nicely. I don't know if it was just that stainless steel or that grade of stainless steel, but I found the brass was much nicer. I also found the missing ball joint, so now the throttle pedal works nicely, and that gives me fully wide open throttle. I also realized that to set the position of the pedal here, I was thinking about some sort of turnbuckle in here or something like that, and then I realized you don't need that, because you can just adjust the position of this arm. If you bring this arm a bit more forwards, it'll bring the pedal a little bit more forwards. Same if you push it back, and there is plenty of movement there on that pedal. So that should be fine. That seems about the right sort of place for heel toe driving, but I won't know till I can actually drive it. So that's all done. I swapped out the cardboard under the car. It is leaking. I think the gearbox is leaking around the drain plug. I've tightened that up a little bit, and that seems to have mostly stopped it. The rear axle does drip very minor amounts as well. I did drill one of the bolts, so this top bolt actually has a hole through it, so that can act as a vent, just to let any air pressure out of the back there. Apparently they can pressurize, so it does drip. I figure with smaller bits of cardboard the drips don't look as bad. If you've got a really massive drip tray underneath there, you're going to expect a massive leak, but it just drops a few little bits and pieces here and there, so that's okay. I think all old cars tend to do that. Let's see, what else? I still haven't really done much with the woodworking, except I did buy on Trade Me, I got this plane, which is a Stanley No. 5, for a really good price. It was a little bit beaten up. The handle was broken here. The thread was bent. Turns out the front handle wasn't actually connected at all. The threaded rod that goes between the base and here was missing. Turns out that's a kind of strange thread. I think it's an American thread. But I was able to measure it, and I think it was a 20 TPI thread. So I just made one up on the lathe using that stainless steel that I got from the linkages, and it didn't turn very well on the lathe either. So other than that, I just stripped it all down and cleaned it all up. I didn't go too mad restoring it. I just made sure the surfaces were flat on a piece of wet and dry. I resharpened the blade, which was well off straight, and that works really well now. It actually works quite nicely. So I think I've got all the woodworking tools I need now. I also recently discovered these, which are Sharpie industrial markers. I didn't know they did an industrial one. It's just the same as a normal Sharpie marker. But if we head over here and see what I've actually been working on. I've been working on a second radiator shell, my second attempt at this, to try and get a better shape, and I've definitely done a much better job this time. And this is where the Sharpies come into it. So you can see I've got lines all over this thing, so I know where the center lines are and where different bits and pieces are going to be. And if you try to draw on steel with a normal Sharpie, it works pretty well, right up to the point that the metal has got anything on it, so any sort of oil or grease or anything like that, and it'll just kill the Sharpies. These ones seem to work a lot better. They do stop working, and then you can sort of scribble on a piece of paper and they'll just start working again, whereas the normal ones just die. As soon as the tips get, I guess they get contaminated or something happens to them, but they stop working. But these seem really good. I also discovered somewhere else to buy these little Stanley dual measurement tape measures, and I was able to get a slightly smaller one, so it's a nice tiny little tape measure. I really like these ones. These are sort of my favorite tape measures. This one came from Radio Spares, RS Components. I also bought some wood screws from them, some little stainless steel ones. So back over here. So these are the screws I will use when I do the timber work, and of course you have to use slotted screws, but I haven't been able to find anywhere that sells slotted steel screws in New Zealand. I'm sure I can get them from overseas and they'll be horrendously expensive, but RS had these stainless steel ones which will work, and they are the right sort of heads on them. I got a few different lengths of those. So realistically, I think these days the glue is what really holds the joints, and the screws are just to pull the joints tight so the glue is under pressure when it sets. But I think those should do the trick. Back over here. So my second radiator shell, the reason I wanted to do it again is because this one ended up a little bit rough. The welding on it wasn't great, and it ended up actually being too narrow. So this, if you look at it, has to fit between those two sort of mounting points down there. And you can see if I push this up against one, it's way too loose. And I think the reason for that is because of the order that I constructed this. So I made this in effectively 5 parts. So there's the sides, the top is made in 2 pieces. So there's a piece here and a piece here, and then there's this piece on the bottom. And when I made this one, I made the top first, so that and then that, I think, and then put the sides on it. And the problem is, when you've got curves like this in a piece of metal, you can bend it around and manipulate it to get the shape you want. So what ended up happening is, in getting the shape of the curve on the top correct, I ended up pulling the sides in. So this time I did it differently. I made the sides, this is all well oversized at the moment, it needs trimming down. I made the sides, I made the front, this piece, and I made this bottom piece, which is effectively just flat. There's a little bit of crown in it, but not much. And I welded these together first, so that would give me the width that I needed. And by bending these out to what I needed, because you can see that the sides are not actually vertical, they slope in a little bit. You can see that on this one, which was the one that was on the car that was restored. It's a bit hard to see with the parallax of the camera. And this is a saloon one, but you look on the top, it's a bit hard to see, but the sides aren't square like that. They actually bend out a little bit, which makes sense because the radiator follows the line of the bonnet, which goes off on an angle. So these aren't flat. So that meant, you can see it much easier there, that the angle, the shape here is slightly wrong. This just needs simple bends to get it to be a nice curve. But that's given me the correct width. And once I had all that set up, I then made the piece that goes on the top, and that's all been welded on. I've TIG welded it, and my welding was much better this time. And I've been really careful with filing this smooth. So there are still a few little imperfections in it, little divots and things, but generally I've been able to planish the welds and get everything nice and smooth and get the the weld seems to almost completely disappear. If you random orbit sand over this, you can make it look very uniform, but it's not necessarily flat. Something like this, it's very important the curves are all correct. So I've mostly been doing that with filing, which is why it looks all scratched up at the moment, because of the file marks. And I did find I would start with this body file, which is pretty coarse. I ended up turning this blade over. This file I've had since I restored the MGB, which was at least 10 or 12 years ago now, I think. And I realized I'd never actually used the other side of the blade, so I turned the blade over so it's much sharper and takes quite an aggressive cut, which leaves a lot of marks on it. And then I switched to this file. I can't remember exactly what sort it is. It's got two patterns. It's got the same pattern as the body file on one side, and it's got a slightly different pattern on the other side. And I find this is really good for smoothing things off. And of course, the beauty of using a file is it shows up all the high spots. So because the file's flat, as you file across, it only touches the high spots, and you'll see any low spots really obviously. And then you can sort of hammer them out. Noisy motorcycle going past. So I'm still in the process of hammering this and filing it, trying to get it perfect. The opening is undersized at the moment. This is effectively where the edge will curl round, and it's also way too high, so it'll actually come down to about here, and there'll be a flange on the bottom. And I'm also going to do the bottom edge slightly differently. On this one I folded it over, and I think what I will do on this is I'll make a separate bottom piece with a flange on the bottom piece that attaches to this. It'll probably be soldered on or silver soldered, something like that, just so that I don't end up distorting this by hammering it over. Because as soon as you try to hammer a flange around on this, because this flange is going around a radius here, you have to shrink it, and what ends up happening is this can distort, especially if you're like me and you don't really know what you're doing. So I figure it's safer to build the bottom separately. I will probably still put the flange on here. This all needs to be cut out, obviously, and there's a circle down here, which is this bit here, and this is where the dynamo sits. I was a lot more careful making this one. So the way I actually made the shape in these, the side pieces were just flat pieces that I put some shape on the wheel, and just to make it so they're not flat. Because if you check the original, you'll see there is actually crown in them, up and down, and top to bottom. Everything's curved. And then this upper edge, so I made the panel, wheeled it up, and then hammered this curve here over a stake in the vise. And for the front and the top, which have an awful lot of curve in them, I use the hammer and the sandbag. So you basically use this, and you just bash the hell out of it to stretch it where you want. So you end up whacking it, and it stretches the metal, and then you can use the wheel here to sort of smooth it all out. And it takes quite a few goes backwards and forwards getting that to work, but it works really well. It's amazing how the wheel will just smooth out the metal. When it came to the top, I thought I would just be able to get away with cutting a flat piece and then shrinking the edge. So if you've got a flat piece and you want it to curve around, you can shrink the edge around, and it'll pull it around, and it'll put curve in the top as well. That didn't really work, so this was my mangled attempt at doing that. And then afterwards I tried to hammer shape into it, but I'd already cut the hole in the middle. You can see this is full of dimples, and that's where I've been hammering it. And then I was going to try smoothing this out to get the shape. And in the end, I gave up on this one. I think having the hole cut first makes things harder because it affects the way the metal moves, because it's not constrained around that hole. So you can see it's kind of distorted, which is why I haven't cut the hole for the filler in this one yet. I figured do that last. And this one wasn't right, but it was actually getting kind of close. But you can see here, I'd have to then shrink this edge down so far to get it to match up, and it just wasn't going to work. So the better way to do that is, instead of shrinking the edge, you stretch the middle, which kind of does the same thing if you think about it. So that's what I did on this one, and it came out much, much better. So as I say, this still needs hammering and filing to get it all smooth. I mean, it's reasonably good. But the finish on this will have to be really good, because I guess really what I want to do is have it nickel plated. And I think what they'll do is, I believe they'll chrome plate it first. And no, sorry, not chrome plate it, copper plate it. So when you're chrome plating something, I believe they do copper and then polish that, and then nickel, and then chrome over the top. So nickel plating is just the copper and then the nickel coating. I'm going to have to find out about that, what the story is with getting that done, how much it's going to cost. But if you're getting something plated, the finish has to be really, really good, because any imperfections are likely to show up. Obviously, if you're painting something, you can leave it a little bit rough, and then you can put a coat of high build primer over it, and then sand it back and then paint it. So, you know, you can be a little bit more rough with your finish, whereas this is going to have to be nice and smooth. I paid a lot more attention to trying to get the shape right. So you can see on this one, the shape on the nose there wasn't great. This is an original. Even this isn't that good. And on this one, if you look at it closely, you can actually see there is a bit of a gap there as well. This seems to be soldered on. So they're not perfect. The other one on this one, again, it's probably going to be really hard to see on camera, is it's not actually symmetrical. The badge is slightly offline, which is interesting, but I guess these were all handmade. But on this one, I was actually... depending on where you place it, the shape that way, left to right, is perfect. The up and down is a little bit off, but this will need hammering as well, because you can see this peak comes down. So this is all kind of effectively a plane in here with a slight curve to it, and you can see on mine that's going to need to be brought down a little bit more, not too much. But when I trim this, I should be able to hammer this edge down to get it to fit nicely. I still need to actually trace out the shape I need. So I'm really pleased with how this is coming out. It's looking a lot better. You can see down here the difference in a partially finished place where you can't really see the file mark, see the weld in the middle, compared to here where I haven't really finished it because this is all going to be cut out, so there's no point. So that's the Radiator. I'm much happier with the second attempt. This fits a much better. It's actually the right width. And the other difference is on this one I used, I believe it was 1mm Zintex steel, which is zinc coated steel, whereas this is 1.2mm just plain cold rolled steel. And a friend of mine did say to me that this would be much nicer to work with, although I was under the impression that this is just cold rolled steel with the zinc coating on it. But no, this is actually nicer to work with. It's definitely much nicer to weld. you can't weld the zinc on that. It's poisonous. You get horrible fumes off it and it makes you quite sick. So you have to get rid of the zinc before you can weld it, which is a pain. This welded really well. I did have one problem with my welder halfway through, which is the high frequency start stopped working for some reason. It was just making arcing noises inside the welder, and I had to switch to scratch start. I actually found that easier, oddly enough. I don't know why, but I found I could start the weld pool exactly where I wanted it and then just start moving it along. When I did the welding on this, I tried not to use any filler at all. And generally you can do that if the seams are really tight and really nicely fitting. You shouldn't need filler, because as soon as you add filler, when you're trying to planish it all flat, you've got extra material there. So you need to get rid of that. So you have to grind that away before you try and hammer it. Otherwise, you've got too much metal in one place. And that worked really well. When you weld the edges here, the hardest thing I found was tacking the edges together. So what I find happens is you've got the two edges touching really tightly and you're trying to get a weld pull across both of them. And what often happens is the surface tension on each side of the metal pulls the metal apart and you get two lumps and a hole in the middle. I don't know how you work around that. Sometimes I can get it to work and sometimes I can't. Maybe it's just practice. So what I started doing was, when I needed to TIG the tack the edges together, I would use filler rod, but I made my own from strips of this steel so that the filler material is exactly the same as the material you're putting into the weld. And that was a trick that Joss taught me doing the aluminium bodies. We made our own filler rods, because then the material is all the same, and when you hammer and file it, it'll behave the same. So I did that here on this. I made my own filler rods from this steel, and that worked really well. And what I found I could do is, say I was doing this seam along here, I could put a little tack weld here and another one here and another one here. And what you do, because the panels are coming up, so this is curving up like this, and this one's curving down, you bring this one up and then put a little edge on it, little 45, and then the same on this one. It comes around and then you put a little tiny curve on the end. And even if the edges don't match up perfectly, you put a little tack, you put another little tack, and then you can hammer and dolly the edges and bring them together. And then when they're touching, you can then weld it, and then later on you go back with the hammer and dolly and you smooth it all out. So even though you're hammering it to get the edges together, and this line will be slightly wavy because you've done that, you can then hammer it smooth. Obviously, the closer you've got everything at the start, the better, the less work you have to do. But it works really well. And so this is how you can end up with what's quite a tight curve there, but it's not actually that hard to weld it. Someone who's actually a welder, this is probably dead simple, but I'm an amateur. I don't do enough of it to get good at it. You do a little bit. By the time you've done the thing you're doing, you get pretty good at it, and then you don't do any for months and months and months, so you lose all those skills again, which kind of makes it interesting. This is a one-off car, so I just have to work on it and do the best I can. So that's kind of where I'm at. I've had to stop because I have got an old injury to my neck. A couple of years ago, I slipped a disc in my neck, and that's been fine ever since, but it's just started hurting a little bit again. But funnily enough, that hasn't been a problem, but just hammering and filing this, I'm a software guy by day, so that much exercise, it's made me a bit sore, to be honest. But I'm getting there. There's no rush. I just do it slowly, a bit at a time. And I think what I should do is, being winter here, of course, it gets quite cold at night, and because Big Shed here isn't insulated, I get flash rust on things. So I'm going to rub this down with some Penetrol or something so that it doesn't rust. The only other little job I've done is, this was the car that was on 8075 after its long history, the Radiator, sorry, after its long history of racing in New Zealand. It was pretty battered around. Obviously this Radiator's been well hacked about. It's too tall, which is the main reason I can't use it. And this is the hilariously off-center dog bone radiator cap, supposedly made by one of the Roycrofts who were racing this car at the time. I'll probably reuse this cap. I think it's one of the things Joss would have really wanted me to do, is to reuse some of this, because this is part of the history. So what I will have to do is find a suitable piece of pipe or tube so I can make the filler cap, and I'll have to machine this thread, which turns out to be I think it was 12 threads per inch thread. So don't actually know if my lathe will cut that. There's a little chart here, 12. This little chart gives you the different sets of gears that you need to be able to cut each particular thread, and it looks like I should have all the right gears to actually cut that 12 TPI thread. This is set up to cut the weird thread that was on the Stanley plane, and that worked fine, just single point thread cutting. So I should be able to, if I can get a suitable piece of pipe or bit of stock I can turn down, machine up a suitable filler neck and reuse this. And then for the actual radiator, I'm still deciding what I'm going to do. I'm probably going to put a fake grill inside here, so from the outside this all looks absolutely correct, and I'll get a modern radiator core that'll go inside here. It'll be hidden as much as possible so you won't really see it. The other thing that these radiators also often had was a stone guard, and that's something I should look at doing on here. I might need to make sort of mounting points on here, and I have got the correct sort of stainless steel mesh, which is, it's pretty much the same as this mesh I used on the MGB, which is why I've got it, because to get these two little pieces of the stainless mesh I had to buy a square meter of the stuff, which I've still got all these years later. So it makes sense to reuse that for the stone guard on the Riley, which will also help hide the fact that it's not a real radiator inside the shell. But I think that's it for today. When I had the steering box off, I took the opportunity to fit the proper bolt that goes through there to lock the arm in place, and I swapped over my old oil pressure gauge just for this modern known working one, and a piece of nylon hose. When I build the actual car, this will all be proper copper tubing, of course. I want it to be as period correct as possible.